The morning Lavinia Merritt fired a warning shot through the front window of the Dusty Creek Land Office. She had not eaten in 2 days, had not slept in 3, and was absolutely certain that no man alive was going to take the last 40 acres her father had left her. The bullet punched a clean hole through the glass and buried itself in the far wall, just above the head of Silas Drummond, who had been leaning back in his chair with the particular smugness of a man who believed the law was something he owned outright. He fell sideways out of his chair with a shriek that brought 2 deputies running from the street, and Lavinia stood in the doorway with the smoking Remington still raised, her dark hair whipping across her face in the November wind of 1879, her brown eyes steady as stone. "That was a warning," she said, her voice carrying no tremor whatsoever. "The next one will not be." She was 26 years old, she was alone, and she was not in the mood. The deputies arrived at the door and stopped when they saw her. One of them, a young man named Petey Halloran, who had grown up 2 farms over from the Merritt place, had the good sense to lower his hand from his holster. The other, a heavy-set man brought in from Abilene whom everyone called Dutch, did not have that same sense and reached for iron. The second shot took Dutch's hat clean off his head. "Lavinia Merritt," Silas Drummond said from the floor, his face gone the color of old paper, "you are out of your mind." "I am out of patience," she corrected. "There is a considerable difference. Now I am going to ask you one more time, Silas. You are going to produce the original deed to the North 40, the one my father filed in 1863, and you are going to acknowledge that the transfer paperwork you submitted last month carries a forged signature, because my father died in April of 1878, and that document is dated September of 1878. And then you are going to leave my land alone." Silas Drummond looked at her from the floor. He looked at the hole in the wall. He looked at his 2 deputies, one of whom was retrieving his hat and one of whom had the decency to look ashamed of himself. "You cannot prove that signature is forged," Drummond said. "I can," said a voice from the street behind her. Lavinia did not lower the gun, but she turned her head enough to see who had spoken. He was leaning against the hitching post outside with his arms folded across his chest, a tall man with the kind of tan that came from years outdoors and not from an afternoon ride. He wore a plain gray coat, trail-worn boots, and a hat pulled low against the November light. He was perhaps 30, 31 at most, with dark brows and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something resistant. He was watching the scene in the doorway with an expression that was not alarmed and was not amused, but was instead simply attentive, the way a man watches something he has already decided to enter into. "And who in the blue blazes are you?" Drummond demanded from the floor. "Vernon Easton," the man said. "I'm a land surveyor and former county assessor out of Wichita, and I have been retained by the Territorial Land Commission to examine irregularities in deed transfers in this county over the last 3 years. He unfolded his arms and reached into his coat, producing a sealed letter which he held up so the light caught the official stamp. "I arrived this morning on the 7 o'clock stage. I had intended to introduce myself at the county office first, but this seemed more pressing." There was a silence in which the wind moved through the street and a horse stamped somewhere nearby. Lavinia studied Vernon Easton for a long moment. She had heard of the Territorial Commission's investigation. She had written to them herself 3 months ago after discovering the forged deed. She had not expected anyone to come, not in time anyway. She lowered the Remington. "You could have announced yourself before I wasted 2 bullets, she said. "You did not appear to need announcing," Vernon said, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "You appeared to have the situation well in hand." "I have the situation half in hand," Lavinia said. "The other half requires documentation." She looked back at Drummond. "This man apparently has." Silas Drummond stood up very slowly, brushing dust from his coat with the careful dignity of a man reassembling his authority. He was calculating. Lavinia could see it in his eyes, the rapid arithmetic of risk and exposure, and she watched as the calculation concluded in a direction he did not like. "This is not over," he said. "It is over enough for today," Vernon Easton said pleasantly, stepping up onto the boardwalk and past Lavinia into the land office. "Deputy, I will need a table and adequate light. Miss Merritt, if you would be so kind as to join me. I believe we have a considerable amount of paperwork to review." Lavinia holstered her pistol. She looked at Vernon Easton's back as he moved toward the table in the center of the room, already opening his case and laying out documents with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. She did not know him. She did not trust anyone, not after the last 18 months, not after watching her father's estate picked apart like a carcass by men like Drummond. But she recognized competence when she saw it, and she followed him inside. That was how Lavinia Merritt first met Vernon Easton, in a land office with gunpowder still in the air and a man on the floor. And it was not, by any measure of convention, a romantic beginning. But then Lavinia had never been a conventional woman, and Vernon Easton, as she would come to understand slowly and then all at once, was not a conventional man. They spent 4 hours in that office, side by side at the table, going through documents. Vernon had a methodical way of working, laying papers out in order, cross-referencing dates, marking discrepancies with a pencil in neat, precise notation. He explained what he was doing as he did it, not in the condescending way men sometimes explained things to women, but in the matter-of-fact way of someone who simply assumed the person beside him was capable of following along. She was. She had kept her father's accounts since she was 16, had managed the Merritt farm through 2 droughts and a cattle sickness that had killed a quarter of their herd. She understood numbers and she understood land, and when she pointed out a secondary discrepancy in the transfer timeline that Vernon had not yet reached, he looked at it, looked at her, and wrote it down without comment. "You have been doing this yourself," he said, near the end of the 3rd hour. It was not a question. "Someone had to," Lavinia said. "How long?" "Since July, when I realized the original filing had been tampered with." "That is 4 months of work," Vernon said. "It would have been faster if Drummond had not had someone break into my house and remove 3 of my folders in September," she said. Vernon stopped writing. He looked at her directly. "He had your house broken into, and my barn burned," she said. "In October, I lost 1 horse and about $200 of stored grain." His expression did not shift dramatically, but something behind his eyes changed, tightened, the same way a man's jaw tightens when he is controlling an emotion he has decided is not useful in this moment. "I am going to need to know all of that," he said. "All of it, in detail." "I expected you to say that," Lavinia said. She reached into the bag she had brought and laid another folder on the table. It was thicker than his. "I have been documenting everything since the beginning." He looked at the folder, he looked at her, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth resolved fully into a smile. "Miss Merritt," he said, "you are going to make my job significantly easier." "That is not why I documented it," she said. "I know," he said. "That makes it considerably more impressive." She did not smile back. She was not ready to smile at Vernon Easton. But she felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the sensation of not being entirely alone in a fight. And that was something she had to be careful with, because she had learned that dependency on other people tended to end badly. The legal process that followed over the next 2 weeks was slow and grinding and exhausting, conducted in a cramped room at the county courthouse with a territorial judge named Harlan Webb who smelled of pipe tobacco, and moved through paperwork the way a river moves through silt, which is to say thoroughly, but without any apparent urgency. Vernon presented the evidence methodically. Lavinia provided testimony 3 times, each time facing a line of questioning from Drummond's attorney that was designed to imply she was hysterical, incompetent, or both. Each time, she answered every question with the flat precision of someone who had prepared for this examination and found it insufficient. Vernon sat at the adjacent table and did not react to the attorney's insinuations. But on the 2nd day, when the man referred to Lavinia as this excitable young woman, Vernon calmly interrupted the proceeding to note that the documentation Miss Merritt had produced was, quote, the most thorough independent land fraud investigation he had encountered in 9 years of work for the commission, and that the court might wish to consider that description before characterizing her further. Judge Webb had looked over his spectacles and said nothing, but he had not allowed the characterization again. After the first week, Vernon had taken a room at the Dusty Creek boarding house, which was the only place in town with rooms to let that did not also operate as a saloon. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Cordelia Fitch, who was 63, and operated her establishment with the firm conviction that decency was a choice, and that people who did not choose it were not welcome at her table. Lavinia had a room there too, having given up the farm after the barn fire, moving in temporarily while she sorted out her situation. They ate breakfast at the same table in Mrs. Fitch's dining room, which was a long pine table that seated 8 and was usually occupied by 4, the other 2 boarders being a traveling dry goods salesman named Horace and a schoolteacher named Miss Alice Pryor, who was 22 and very shy. Mrs. Fitch served eggs and cornbread and coffee that was strong enough to offend a lesser constitution, and she presided over the table with the serene authority of a woman who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. On the 3rd morning, over coffee, Vernon asked Lavinia about her father. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. Then she said, "He was a good man. He came out here in 1861 with nothing but a mule and a seed bag. He built the Merritt place from raw dirt. He was the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard enough and kept your word, things would be all right." "Was he right?" Vernon asked, not unkindly. "He died alone and cheated," Lavinia said. "So no, but he believed it his whole life, and maybe that counts for something." "It counts for something," Vernon said. "You are very easy to talk to," Lavinia said, and she said it not as a compliment but as an observation that slightly concerned her, the way you might note that a bridge looks sturdy and immediately want to check the supports. Vernon looked at her over his coffee cup. "I will take that as the ambiguous thing it is," he said. "Good," she said, "because that is how I meant it." They were quiet for a while, eating. Outside, the November wind was persistent and cold, pushing dust through the gaps in the window frames and making the lamp over the table flicker. "Why did you take this assignment?" Lavinia asked eventually. "Dusty Creek is not exactly a plum posting." "I requested it," Vernon said. That surprised her. "Why?" "Because I have been through a lot of counties in this territory," he said, "and Dusty Creek has the highest concentration of deed fraud complaints relative to its size that I have seen. That means either someone is very sloppy or someone is very confident. Either way, it wants attention." "Drummond has been doing this for years," Lavinia said. "He has been picking off small landowners, mostly widows and people without legal resources. My father was not his first." "I know," Vernon said. "Your file is not the only one I brought with me." She stared at him. "How many?" 14 confirmed, possibly as many as 23 pending verification. The number sat on the table between them like something heavy. "And none of those people had any recourse," she said. "They did not know how to find it," Vernon said, "or they were too frightened. Or they did not have the resources to pursue it. That is the nature of this kind of fraud. It targets people who are already at a disadvantage." "It is theft," Lavinia said. "That is what it is, dressed up in legal language, but it is theft from people who could not afford to lose what was taken." "Yes," Vernon said. He did not dress it up. He did not offer her a softened version. He simply agreed, and she found that honesty more comforting than any reassurance would have been. On the 9th day of the proceeding, Judge Webb ruled that the transfer of the Merritt North 40 was invalid on the basis of fraudulent documentation and ordered the title restored. He also ordered an inquiry into the 14 additional cases Vernon had presented, and Drummond was placed under a restraining order pending the investigation. Drummond was not happy. He was escorted from the courthouse by P.D. Halloran, who had quietly shifted his allegiances once the weight of evidence became clear, and he said nothing as he left, which was more frightening than anything he might have said. A silent, angry man with connections was a thing to be cautious about. Lavinia stood on the courthouse steps in the cold November afternoon and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for about 7 months. Vernon came to stand beside her. He said nothing for a moment, and she appreciated that. Some victories needed a moment of quiet before anyone said anything about them. "The North 40 is yours," he said finally. "It always was," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Now the paperwork knows it too." She almost smiled, almost. She was still cautious with smiling at Vernon Easton. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the investigation?" "I stay, possibly another 2 or 3 weeks. I need to go through each of the other cases, meet with the affected parties, compile the full report for the commission. And after that I submit my findings, and the commission decides whether to pursue criminal charges." Against Drummond. "Against Drummond and potentially against at least 2 members of the county record's office," Vernon said, "and possibly 1 judge, though that is a more complicated matter." Lavinia turned to look at him. "You are not afraid of doing that, going after powerful men?" Vernon met her eyes. "I am afraid of not doing it," he said simply. "That has always seemed like the worst option." She looked at him for a moment in the cold afternoon light. This methodical, unhurried, quietly principled man who had driven into her disaster and gotten to work without dramatics and without asking anything from her except cooperation. She felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling begin to press against the inside of her chest. She looked away first. "I need to go see the farm," she said. "Now that the title is secure, assess the damage from the barn fire, decide what needs to be done before spring." "I can come with you," Vernon said, "if you want a second pair of eyes." "I do not need you to come with me," she said. "I did not say you needed it," he said. "I said I could come." She was quiet. The wind moved between them. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "early." They rode out to the Merritt farm in the thin gray light of a December morning that had not yet decided whether it intended to be cold or simply cool, and ended up being both. Lavinia rode her remaining horse, a steady bay mare named Concordia, and Vernon rode a chestnut gelding hired from the livery. They did not talk much on the ride out, which was 6 miles from town on a road that was more suggestion than fact in the winter months, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The farm was in worse shape than she had let herself think about. The burned barn was a skeleton of blackened timber, open to the sky, the smell of char still present even after 6 weeks. The house was standing, solid enough, her father's construction having been the kind that did not give up easily, but the windows needed boarding and the front step had given way, and there were signs that animals had been denning under the porch. Lavinia stood in the yard and looked at it and said nothing for a long time. Vernon stood a few feet away and looked at it too. He did not say anything helpful like "it is not so bad" or "you can fix this up easy enough." He just looked at it alongside her, which was the right thing to do. "My father built this house," she said finally. "Every board. He and a neighbor spent 3 summers on it." "It is sound," Vernon said after a moment's honest assessment. "The bones are good. The damage is mostly cosmetic and repairable." "I know," she said. "I know that. It is just—" She stopped. "It is just that it should not have had to be repaired at all," he said. "Yes." They walked the property for 2 hours after that, Lavinia making notes in her small leather-bound book, Vernon examining the barn structure and the fence lines and the state of the fields. He knew about land. Not just the legal paperwork of it, but the actual physical nature of it, soil and drainage and grade, and he made observations that were useful and did not belabor them. At noon they ate at the kitchen table, Lavinia having thought to bring bread and hard cheese and 2 apples, and they drank water from the well, which was, thankfully, still clean and functioning. "You intend to come back here," Vernon said. It was not a question. "It is my home," she said. "Of course I intend to come back. Alone. I have lived alone before." "I know," he said. "I am asking if you have thought about the practical difficulties. Drummond is not a resolved situation yet. The restraining order holds him at a distance, but it does not make him harmless." "I am aware of that," she said. "I am not suggesting you cannot manage it," he said carefully. "I am suggesting that managing it alone would be harder than it has to be." "Most things are harder alone than they have to be," Lavinia said. "That does not mean there is always another option." Vernon turned his apple in his hands, looking at the table. He had a way of pausing before he said important things, not from hesitation but from deliberateness, as if he wanted to be sure he meant what he was about to say. "There is sometimes another option," he said. She looked up at him. "Vernon," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "Too early. I am not unaware that it is too early." "It is considerably too early," she said. "I have known you for 2 weeks. You came here for a job. You are leaving when the job is done." "Those are accurate statements," he said. "And I am not," she said, and here her voice acquired a particular quality, not angry but certain, the voice of someone who has thought about a thing very carefully and arrived at a position they intend to hold. "I am not a temporary arrangement for a man who happens to be in the area. I am not someone to keep company with until the next posting comes through. I will not be any man's convenience, Vernon. Not any man's." She said it clearly, without heat but without softness either, looking at him straight across the table with her brown eyes direct and steady. Vernon held her gaze. He did not flinch from it. He did not look apologetic or chastened or like a man who had been rebuked. He looked like a man who was listening very carefully and taking what he heard seriously. "I hear you," he said. "Good. I want you to hear me too," he said. "I am not offering you convenience. I am not in the habit of offering convenience. What I am considering offering you, when enough time has passed that it is reasonable to offer it, is considerably more than that." "What does considerably more look like?" she asked, and her voice was still careful, still guarded, but there was a thread of something underneath it that had not been there a moment ago. "It looks like a life," he said. "A whole one. Not a temporary arrangement or a passing company. It looks like being here in this county doing work that matters, with a woman who shoots warning shots through land office windows and keeps better documentation than any fraud investigator I have ever met." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. Outside, the winter wind moved across the fields. "You do not even know me," she said. "Not truly." "No," he agreed. "But I am finding that I would like to, very much, if you are willing to allow that." She looked at him for a long time, this man across her father's kitchen table, this careful, honest, unhurried man who had come into her disaster and worked beside her without asking for gratitude or credit, who had called her documentation impressive without condescension, who had stood beside her in the courthouse and had not let anyone call her excitable twice, who sat here now and did not try to minimize what she had said or argue her out of her caution, but simply said, "I hear you and I want you to hear me too. I am not easy," she said finally. "I want you to understand that clearly. I did not come to Dusty Creek for easy," he said. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with any kind of fanfare, just quietly the way seasons shift, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of small changes until one day you look up and something is different. "More time," she said. "All the time you need," he said. They rode back to town in the afternoon, and the silence between them was different from the morning silence, warmer, charged with something neither of them named yet. The investigation into Drummond's fraud cases extended far beyond 3 weeks. By mid-December, Vernon had identified 21 cases of clear document fraud and was corresponding daily with the Territorial Land Commission in Topeka, building the kind of careful, airtight case that does not fall apart under a good attorney's pressure. He had extended his stay indefinitely, taking a longer arrangement with Mrs. Fitch, who charged him a reasonable rate and fed him well and asked him very few questions, which suited everyone. Lavinia, for her part, went back to the farm. She hired a man named Cutter Briggs, who was 50 and had worked the Merritt land back when her father was alive, and who was deeply offended by what Drummond had done to the place, to help with the barn repairs and the fence lines. She went back and forth between the farm and town, staying at Mrs. Fitch's when the weather was too rough for the road or when Vernon needed her testimony for one of the additional cases. They fell into a rhythm that was neither courtship nor simple professional cooperation, but something in between, something that was building itself carefully, without pressure, in the natural way of things that are genuine. In the evenings at Mrs. Fitch's, they sometimes sat in the parlor by the stove with the other boarders, reading or talking or playing cards. Vernon played cards poorly and knew it and was cheerful about the fact, which Lavinia found unexpectedly endearing. She played well, having learned from her father, and she beat him consistently and without mercy, which he accepted with good humor. One night in mid-December, he produced from his room a small book of poetry he had been carrying in his pack. He did not make a production of it. He simply set it on the table between them and said, "This has been in my pack for 2 years. I never seem to have time for it on the road." Lavinia picked it up. It was Whitman. Leaves of Grass, 1855 edition, worn at the spine and with a few passages underlined in pencil. "Who underlined these?" she asked. "I did," he said. She read the underlined lines. They were not the famous ones, not the grand declarations, but quieter passages about belonging somewhere, about the particular dignity of ordinary work and ordinary days. She set the book down and looked at him, and this time she did not look away first. "You are a surprising man, Vernon Easton," she said. "I am a fairly simple man," he said. "I suspect what you are calling surprising is just the gap between your expectations and reality." "My expectations have not been generous lately," she admitted. "That is understandable," he said, "given what the last year has been." She was quiet. Then she said, "My father used to read to me in the evenings, out on the porch in the summer. He was not an educated man, but he loved words. He said they were the one thing nobody could take from you." "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Vernon said. "He was," she said. "He would have liked you, I think. He did not have much patience for men who performed their virtues loudly. He preferred the kind that just did the work." Vernon said nothing, but the thing at the corner of his mouth was there again, quiet and warm. Christmas came to Dusty Creek the way it came to most small western towns in 1879, with not much ceremony and a great deal of practicality. Mrs. Fitch put a wreath on the door and made a special supper of roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and the whole boarding house sat together at the long table, including Cutter Briggs, who had nowhere else to be, and Miss Alice Pryor, who had written a letter to her family in Ohio, and was trying not to look sad about the distance. After supper, Mrs. Fitch produced a bottle of something that she described only as Christmas medicine, and everyone had a small glass, and Horace the salesman sang a carol that he mostly remembered, and the evening was simple and warm and good. Vernon and Lavinia ended up on the covered porch afterward, standing in the cold with their coats on, looking at the sky, which was very clear and very full of stars. Dusty Creek had no gas lighting, only a few oil lamps in windows, and the darkness between the buildings was true darkness, which meant the stars were extraordinary. "Do you miss Wichita?" she asked. "Not particularly," he said. "I was not there much. The job keeps me moving. Does that bother you?" "The moving?" He considered this honestly. "It did not used to," he said. "It has begun to somewhat in the last year or so." "Why?" she asked. He turned to look at her. The lamplight from the window lit the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the directness of his eyes. "Because moving does not mean anything unless there is somewhere you are moving toward," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Vernon," she said softly. "I know," he said. "Still too early." "Getting less early," she said, which was not what she had intended to say, and she knew it the moment it came out. He heard it. She could tell by the way his expression changed, not dramatically, just a deepening, a settling, like a thing that had been uncertain finding its footing. "Lavinia," he said. She turned back to look at the stars. "I am cold," she said. "I am going inside." "All right," he said. She went in. At the door, she paused and looked back at him once, and he was still looking at the stars, and she stood there for one moment watching him and feeling the full, terrible, inconvenient weight of the fact that she trusted this man, that she had trusted him almost from the beginning and had been fighting it ever since, and that fighting it was becoming increasingly difficult and possibly increasingly pointless. She went inside. That night she lay in the dark in her room and had an honest conversation with herself, which was the kind she had learned to have after her father died, and there was no one else to have them with. She asked herself what she was afraid of, and she answered honestly. She was afraid of needing someone and having them leave. She was afraid of building something with a person and having the ground give way underneath it. She was afraid of the particular loneliness that comes from losing something you had allowed yourself to have. She had lived through that loneliness already, losing her father, losing the farm in stages to Drummond's schemes, and she did not know if she had the constitution for it again. And then she asked herself whether being afraid of a thing was sufficient reason to refuse it entirely, and she did not have as clean an answer for that one. In the first week of January, two things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Silas Drummond violated the restraining order. He had apparently decided that the legal situation, which was turning increasingly against him, needed direct action to remedy, and his idea of direct action was to have two of his remaining men ride out to the Merritt farm on a cold Tuesday night and attempt to complete the destruction they had started with the barn. Cutter Briggs, who had been sleeping in the repaired barn loft, heard them first. He had a shotgun and was not shy about using it, and the two men departed without accomplishing much except scattering the chickens and putting two buckshot holes in the new fence rail. Nobody was hurt. But Lavinia came back to town the next morning with a face like a closed door and went directly to the county sheriff's office, where she filed a report with a thoroughness and a controlled fury that made the deputy on duty look slightly afraid. Vernon had been at the courthouse when she came in, and he came to find her at the sheriff's office afterward. He found her on the bench outside, alone, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the middle distance with an expression he could not quite read. He sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, just beside her. "Cutter is all right?" he asked. "Cutter is fine," she said. "He is annoyed about the fence rail. The sheriff is filing the complaint. It violates the restraining order clearly enough that even Judge Webb will have to act on it." "Good," Vernon said. She was quiet. Then she said, "I am tired, Vernon." It was such a simple thing to say, and it carried so much inside it. Not just physical tiredness, though she was that too. The tiredness that comes from fighting for too long on too many fronts with too few resources. The tiredness that goes all the way down into the bones and stays there. He did not say anything that minimized it. He did not say you are almost through it or it will be over soon. He just said, "I know." And then, because he was Vernon Easton and he did things with the deliberateness of someone who meant them, he reached over and put his hand over her folded hands and held them. She looked at his hand on hers. She did not pull away. She let herself have it just for that moment, the warmth of it, the steadiness of it, the simple animal comfort of not being alone. "I am not going anywhere," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the case, whatever the commission decides, I am not going anywhere." She looked at him. "You cannot promise that," she said. "You have a job, a posting. You go where the commission sends you." "I requested this assignment," he said. "I can request a permanent posting here, county assessor for this district. The position has been vacant for 2 years because nobody wanted the assignment. I want it." She stared at him. "You have thought about this?" "I have thought about it considerably," he said. "Vernon, I told you told me you would not be any man's convenience," he said. "I told you I was not offering convenience. I am telling you now as plainly as I know how that what I am offering is my entire life. Here, in this county. Beside whatever you are building." He held her gaze with a steadiness that she felt in the center of her chest. "I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am asking you to know that this is where I want to be, not temporarily, not as a passing arrangement, permanently and completely and with no reservations." Lavinia looked at him for a long time. The January street was quiet and cold around them. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. She thought about her father's farm and the way it looked in the morning, the particular quality of the light on those fields when the seasons turned. She thought about the feel of her own land under her feet, the ownership of something she had built and defended, and would continue to build and defend. She thought about doing it alone, which she had done and could continue to do, and she thought about doing it alongside this man, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. "I have not decided anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I need you to understand that my land, my farm, my independence, those are not negotiable. Those are who I am." "I understand that," he said. "I would not want them to be negotiable. They are a considerable part of what I admire about you." She was quiet. "You are making this very difficult," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite complaint. "I am being honest," he said. "I find it works better than the alternative." She looked down at their hands, his over hers, and she turned hers over slowly, and she held his hand back. The second thing that happened in the first week of January was that Silas Drummond was formally arrested. Judge Webb, faced with the clear restraining order violation and the mounting weight of the commission's evidence, signed the warrant on Thursday morning. P.D. Halloran carried it out personally, and Drummond was taken into custody at his house on the edge of town, while his wife watched from the front step with an expression that suggested she was not entirely surprised. The arrest sent a particular ripple through Dusty Creek that was partly relief, partly disbelief, and partly the particular cautious hope of people who had been afraid for a long time and were not yet sure they were allowed to stop being afraid. Several of the other families whose land had been taken came to the courthouse in the days that followed, some of whom Lavinia had never met, and there were conversations in the hallways and on the steps that were about more than legal proceedings, that were about what it meant to have someone actually pursue this, to have it taken seriously, to have it reaching a conclusion. Vernon handled all of it with the same steady, methodical competence with which he handled everything, and Lavinia found herself watching him in these moments, in the hallways, in the courthouse, talking to a 60-year-old woman named Beatrice Harmon whose farm had been taken 2 years ago. The way he listened to her, the way he treated her account with the same seriousness he gave every document, the way he looked her in the eye and said, "Your land should never have been taken, and we are going to do everything we can to remedy this." There was something about witnessing a person be consistently good in small, unobserved moments. It did something to Lavinia that could not be undone. On a Friday evening in mid-January, after a long day at the courthouse, they walked back to Mrs. Fitch's in the early dark of the winter evening. There was snow on the ground, the first real snow of the season, and it had turned the plain, unpretty town into something temporarily beautiful, every surface smoothed and luminous in the lamplight from the windows. They had not been talking particularly. It had been a long day and they were both tired, and the quiet had the comfortable quality that had become familiar to them. At the gate of Mrs. Fitch's house, Lavinia stopped. Vernon stopped too and looked at her. She turned to face him in the lamplight and the snow, and she looked at him with the full directness of her gaze, not guarded now, not careful, but open, and she said, "I am 30 years old in March." He waited. "I have been alone for the better part of the last 2 years," she said. "I have managed, I have been fine, but I am." She stopped, and then she said, with the particular courage of someone being honest about something they would rather be private, "I am done being fine. I want to be more than fine. I think I want—" She stopped again. "What do you want, Lavinia?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and low and very careful with her. "I think I want what you said," she said. "If you meant it." "I meant every word of it," he said. Then she looked at him. The snow was falling again lightly, the small kind of snow that comes down more like settling than falling. "Then I think we should stop dancing around it and decide what we are doing." He took one step toward her, closing most of the distance between them, and the look on his face was not triumphant but tender, deeply tender, the face of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and is now being told he can set it down and rest. "I would like very much," he said, "to court you properly, with your permission." "You have my permission," she said. "Do not waste it." He reached out and took her hand, right there in the snow in front of Mrs. Fitch's gate, and she let him. and for the first time in a very long time, Lavinia Merritt felt like the ground beneath her feet was completely solid. Mrs. Fitch watched them from the parlor window and said nothing, but she was smiling. The courtship of Lavinia Merritt and Vernon Easton was, by the standards of Dusty Creek, Kansas in 1880, an unusually equal arrangement. They did not perform the social rituals of a courtship, designed to display Lavinia's domestic virtues to Vernon's approval, because Vernon had no interest in approving of Lavinia's domestic arrangements and was quite forthright about this. What they did instead was spend time together in the genuine way of people who are finding out how much they like each other when there is no pressure on the discovery. They went back to the farm together regularly, working on repairs through January and into February, Cutter Briggs with them much of the time, and there were long days of practical labor followed by evenings where they sat by the kitchen fire and talked about things that mattered, about the land and the work and the cases, and what they believed about people and justice and the nature of things. Vernon was building his case for the permanent county assessor position. He had submitted his application to the Territorial Commission and received a favorable preliminary response. The land fraud case against Drummond was proceeding through the courts with what felt, for a territorial court, like genuine momentum, and 3 of the affected families had already had their property formally restored. In February, Beatrice Harmon got her farm back. She came to the courthouse on the day the order was signed and shook Vernon's hand for a very long time, and then she turned to Lavinia and held her face in her hands and said, "You are the reason anyone started looking. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise," and Lavinia had to look very hard at a point above Beatrice's head to keep herself composed. Afterward, walking back through the cold February afternoon, Vernon said, "She is right, you know." "You did the work," Lavinia said. "You started it," he said. "You wrote the letters, you kept the documentation. You did not give up when they burned your barn. You walked into that land office with a pistol and you did not back down. All of it started with you." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father would have hated that I fired a gun in a county office. Would he? He believed in the law. He also built a life with his hands on difficult ground against considerable opposition," Vernon said. "I suspect he would have understood the instinct." She laughed. It was a real laugh, full and sudden, and it surprised her as much as it surprised him. She did not laugh often. When she did, it was like a brief clarification of something that had been obscured. Vernon looked at her with an expression that she recognized now for what it was, had been recognizing for weeks, the particular warmth of a man who is watching someone and is very simply glad to be near them. She recognized it because she felt the same thing when she looked at him, had been feeling it for weeks, and had stopped pretending she did not. Spring came to Dusty Creek in early March, which on the Kansas prairie meant the mud that comes before the grass, the tentative returning warmth, and the persistent possibility of one more freeze. Lavinia turned 30 on a Tuesday in the first week of March. She had not told Vernon when her birthday was, but Mrs. Fitch had mentioned it to him in passing, in the way that Mrs. Fitch occasionally arranged things without appearing to arrange them. He arrived at the farm that Tuesday with a small tin of tea, which was a luxury in 1880, and a square of good cloth he had gotten from the dry goods store, the blue-green color of shallow water, which he handed to her without preamble, saying only, "Happy birthday. I thought you might like the color." She held the cloth and looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said, "How did you know I liked this color?" "The scarf you wear in the cold," he said. "Similar shade." She had not thought he noticed things like that. Or rather, she had thought he noticed everything, but had not expected to be the subject of such specific attention. She set the cloth carefully on the table and said, "Stay for supper." He stayed for supper. Cutter Briggs made himself scarce at the barn, with the particular diplomacy of a man who has been watching something develop for weeks and has decided his presence is not required that evening. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the chicken she had put on in the afternoon, and the light from the fire made the room look like something out of the past, like her father's kitchen had looked when she was young and the world had been smaller and safer. They ate slowly, and they talked for a long time after the meal, not about the case or the work, but about things further back. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, a farm family, 5 siblings, a father who was strict but not unkind, a mother who had died when he was 14, and whose absence had been a silence in the house that no one ever directly named. He had left Ohio at 19 to go west with a surveying company and had not gone back, not because of any animosity, but because the West had felt like where he belonged, the open space of it, the uncompleted nature of it. She told him about her mother, who had also died young, when Lavinia was 7, of a fever that swept through the county in the summer of 1861. She remembered her mother's hands more than her face. Her mother had beautiful hands, quick and sure, and she had been the one who taught Lavinia to read, sitting together at this same table, before there were chairs that matched or glass in all the windows. "So we both grew up with fathers who did the work of 2 people," Vernon said. "And here we are," she said, "having turned out more or less functional despite it." "More than functional," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and certain and entirely without flattery. She looked at him across the table in the firelight in her father's kitchen on her 30th birthday, and she felt something settle inside her the way foundations settle in good solid ground, deeply and without drama, the settling that is not giving way but is instead arriving. "Vernon," she said. "Lavinia," he said, "I am going to say something and I need you to simply hear it without making it into a great occasion," she said. "All right," he said carefully. "I love you," she said. "I have been coming to it for months and I have arrived and I am not going to pretend I have not. I love you. There it is." He was absolutely still for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was lower than usual and had something in it she had not heard before, something carefully held that was now being carefully released, "I have loved you since you held a Remington to Silas Drummond's wall and told him there was a considerable difference between out of your mind and out of your patience." She stared at him. "That was 2 weeks into knowing you." "I know," he said. "It alarmed me considerably." "Good," she said, and she laughed again, that full real laugh. And this time he laughed too, and it filled the kitchen, her father's kitchen, warm with fire and food and spring coming outside the windows, and it was the sound of something that had been a long time building and had finally arrived. He came around the table and she stood, and when he kissed her, it was not tentative or performative but warm and certain. The kiss of 2 people who have found their way to each other through considerable difficulty and intend to stay found. The trial of Silas Drummond concluded in April of 1880 after 3 weeks of proceedings that drew observers from 4 counties and were reported in the Dodge City Times. Drummond was convicted on 11 counts of document fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy, and was sentenced to 8 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. 2 members of the county records office were convicted on lesser charges and removed from their positions. The circuit judge, who had been implicated in the quieter way, being the one who had approved several of the fraudulent transfers without adequate examination, resigned from his position quietly in March before the full weight of the evidence reached him, which was not a satisfying resolution, but was the practical one available. 14 of the 21 affected families had their land restored by the end of April. The remaining 7 cases were more complicated, involving property that had already been resold to third parties, and those resolutions would take another full year of legal work to untangle. Vernon committed to seeing them through, and Lavinia, who by this point had become something of an unofficial advocate for the affected families, was beside him in every meeting. Vernon received his permanent appointment as county assessor for the Dusty Creek district in March, which came with a salary that was modest by Wichita standards and entirely adequate by Kansas Prairie standards. He took a longer lease on his room at Mrs. Fitch's and began looking at properties, because a man who intends to stay somewhere needs to put down something more permanent than a boarding house room. He found a lot on the east side of town, adjacent to the lot where the new county records office was being built, and he bought it for $230, which was most of his savings, and he began to build on it in the evenings and on weekends with the help of Cutter Briggs, who had by this time adopted Vernon with the proprietary loyalty of a man who believes he has good judgment about people. He did not tell Lavinia what he was building until April, when enough of it was standing to be recognizable as a house. He took her to see it on a Sunday afternoon, and she stood on the rough front step and looked at the rising walls and the framed windows and the careful construction, and she said nothing for a long moment. "It has a large kitchen," Vernon said, "and a study for the papers and the books, and the bedroom faces east for the morning light. I know you prefer morning light." She turned to look at him. Her expression was something he had not seen from her before, not the guarded look or the direct look or even the warm look that he had come to love, but something softer and more vulnerable, the look of someone being shown that they have been seen. "Vernon Easton," she said. "Lavinia Merritt," he said, "you built a house." "I am building a house," he said. "It is not finished. I thought it would be premature to finish it without having a conversation first." She looked at the house. She looked at him. The afternoon light was warm and golden, the particular quality of Kansas light in April that makes everything look like a painting. "Ask me the question," she said. He had not planned a grand speech. He had thought about it but had decided against speeches, as not being his nature and possibly not being hers either. He simply said, standing in the dirt in front of an unfinished house, with Cutter Briggs pretending to be very interested in something at the far end of the lot, "Lavinia, I want to spend my life with you. All of it, the hard parts and the good parts and the parts we cannot predict. I want to build this house with you and build everything else with you. You are the most honest and capable and remarkable person I have met in my life, and I love you completely. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her face the same thing he had watched her carry for months, the wariness that came from being hurt and the hope that was stronger than the wariness, fighting each other one last time and resolving in the way he had not been certain of until this moment. "Yes," she said. "I will." He exhaled. He had not been aware of holding his breath, but he had been. She crossed the distance between them and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with the full force of something that had been decided and was done being tentative. And from the far end of the lot, there was a sound that was clearly Cutter Briggs not successfully suppressing something between a whoop and a laugh. They were married in June of 1880 at the Dusty Creek First Methodist Church, which was a small white building that held 40 people and was filled with 41, Mrs. Fitch having refused to give up her front row seat to the arithmetic of capacity. Lavinia wore a dress that Mrs. Fitch had helped her make from the blue-green cloth Vernon had given her for her birthday, altered and built out with white at the collar and cuffs. And she wore her hair up with a few pieces coming down around her face, and she looked, according to Mrs. Fitch, like someone who had decided to be happy and had meant it. Vernon wore his good coat and a new shirt and his best hat, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle on the arm of Cutter Briggs, who was the closest thing to family either of them had in Dusty Creek, and his expression for that whole walk was the expression of a man who cannot believe his circumstances and is very grateful for them. Reverend Theodore Ames, who had been serving the Dusty Creek congregation for 15 years and had seen the full range of human ceremony, said afterward to his wife that it was one of the better weddings he had presided over, not because of any particular grandeur, but because both people said their vows as if they meant each word individually, and you did not always get that. Miss Alice Pryor cried. Horace the salesman blew his nose dramatically into a handkerchief. Beatrice Harmon, who had come from her restored farm for the occasion, smiled the smile of someone who feels that justice has been served in multiple directions. The reception was held in the yard outside the church, because the June day was fine and warm, and the yard had been strung with paper lanterns by Mrs. Fitch and her sister, who had come down from Abilene for the occasion. There was dancing to a fiddle played by a man named Pete Sutter who knew 40 songs and played them all at roughly the same tempo, which was perfectly adequate for the purposes of the afternoon. Vernon danced with Lavinia, and he was not a polished dancer, but he was willing and attentive, and he did not step on her feet, which she later told him was the primary criterion by which she had judged the dancing acceptable. She was laughing when she said it, the real laugh, and he held her hand and thought, as he had thought several times since April, that he had done the best and luckiest thing of his life in requesting this assignment. They moved into the house on Main Street East at the end of June, the house now finished, with a kitchen that had 2 windows and a proper iron stove and shelves that Vernon had built himself along the east wall for her books and his papers, and the combined library they had been accumulating between them, which was already respectably sized. The study held his surveying equipment, and the filing system that Lavinia organized with a rigorous logic that he found both admirable and slightly intimidating. The east-facing bedroom had the morning light she liked, coming in gold and clean over the flat horizon of the Kansas prairie. The Merritt farm, 24 miles from town, they kept. Cutter Briggs lived there full-time now, managing it as a working ranch, sending Lavinia a portion of the proceeds and keeping the rest as his wage and his home. It was her land, the land her father had built, and she went out to it regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with Vernon, and she stood on it and breathed it and felt the particular grounding that comes from earth you have defended and won. In the summer and fall of 1880, the work of the assessor's office continued, and the remaining 7 fraud cases slowly resolved. Vernon's thoroughness and Lavinia's advocacy between them moved mountains of paperwork and 3 different courts, and by the end of October, every one of the 21 families had either had their land restored or received fair compensation where restoration was impossible. The last case closed on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and Vernon came home from the courthouse that evening and stood in the doorway of the kitchen where Lavinia was making supper and said, "It is done, all of them." She turned from the stove and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their house with the supper on the stove and the October evening coming in at the windows. And it was a moment that held a great many things at once, satisfaction and relief and grief for what those families had been put through, and gratitude that it had been addressed, and the deep particular warmth of sharing something large with someone you love. "Your father would be proud," Vernon said into her hair. She held him tighter for a moment. Then she stepped back and said, "Supper is ready," and she was blinking a little more than usual. They ate supper and talked about the next stage of the assessor work, which was building a proper property registry for the county that would make this kind of fraud significantly harder to perpetrate in the future. And the conversation was practical and forward-looking, and they were both good at forward-looking. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a hard one. The snow came early and stayed, and the Kansas prairie in deep winter is not a gentle landscape. But the house on Main Street East was solid, and the iron stove kept the rooms warm, and they had laid in enough wood and provisions before the first freeze to be comfortable through the worst of it. In those long winter evenings, they read to each other. Lavinia reading from the Whitman that Vernon had brought and from the other volumes they had accumulated. Vernon reading from the newspapers that came on the stage twice weekly, from the accounts of what was happening in the wider world, the railroads coming further west, the political disputes in Washington, the ongoing complexities of the Reconstruction in the South, and the treatment of the native peoples across the territories, which they talked about with the seriousness those subjects deserved. Neither of them inclined to look away from the injustices that marked the era they lived in. There was a Cheyenne family who had been pushed off their land in the neighboring county and had come to Dusty Creek in November. The Tall Horse family, consisting of a man named James Tall Horse, who had converted to Methodist Christianity 15 years before, and his wife Clara and their 4 children. And they had nowhere to go because the claim they had been allotted under the Indian settlement had been quietly reallocated by a county administrator, in a different but related flavor of the same fraud Vernon had been fighting in Dusty Creek. Vernon spent 3 weeks on that case through December, and the result was not a complete victory, because the systems that created the injustice in the first place were not things a county assessor could individually dismantle, but it was enough of a victory to get the family into a valid legal claim on a plot outside town. And James Tall Horse came to the assessor's office the day the papers were signed and shook Vernon's hand with both of his and said, "You are an honest man. That is rarer than it should be." Yes. Vernon said, "I had good help," and he meant Lavinia, who had done the secondary research on that case and had written a letter to the Territorial Commission so sharply argued that it had moved things a month faster than they would otherwise have moved. In March of 1881, Lavinia told Vernon she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning over breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and saying simply, "I believe we are going to need the study to eventually become a different room." He looked at her. He went completely still for a moment. Then a smile broke over his face, the kind that starts slow and becomes enormous, and he came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her with such thoroughness that the coffee went cold. They were very happy about it, and they were not performatively happy about it in the way of people who are telling others how happy they are. They were privately, quietly, deeply happy about it in the way of people who have found each other and are now finding something additional together, and it was their happiness, kept warm between them. Lavinia was strong throughout the pregnancy, which was the nature of Lavinia, who was not inclined to be undone by physical difficulty. But the summer of 1881 was brutally hot on the Kansas prairie, and there were weeks in July and August when the heat made everything harder, and Vernon rearranged the work of the assessor's office to be mostly done in the morning hours when it was cooler, and came home in the afternoons to be with her. And she did not tell him. He did not need to, because she had started telling the truth about what she needed and what she wanted, which was a habit she had built carefully and intended to keep. They had a son in October of 1881, born in the east-facing bedroom in the morning light, delivered by Dr. Anselm Pratt, who had been practicing medicine in Dusty Creek for 20 years, and who told Lavinia afterwards that she was the most composed person he had attended in a labor room in his career, to which Lavinia said, "I have been through worse." And Dr. Pratt, who had heard something about the events of November 1879, said he rather believed that was true. The boy was strong and loud from the first minute and had his father's dark brows and his mother's brown eyes, and they named him Thomas, after Lavinia's father Thomas Merritt, which was Vernon's suggestion and which made Lavinia hold the baby for a long, quiet moment before she said, "Yes, Thomas, that is exactly right." Thomas Easton was, by the collective opinion of everyone in the Dusty Creek boarding house, the county record's office, Mrs. Fitch's parlor, and the surrounding farmland, the finest baby produced in the county in living memory. This assessment was probably not objective, but it was held with conviction. Mrs. Fitch came to see him the day after he was born, and stood holding him in the doorway of the bedroom, with an expression of such profound satisfaction that it was clear she had considered this child something of a personal achievement. Cutter Briggs came in from the Merritt farm with a wool blanket he had been working on in secret through the summer, knitted with the particular concentration of a man who had taught himself a new skill in order to produce a specific thing, and it was uneven in places and magnificent in the spirit of it. Life in Dusty Creek organized itself around the new fact of Thomas, and it did not diminish anything, it expanded everything, the way the arrival of something good tends to make the space around it larger rather than smaller. The assessor's office thrived. The property registry Vernon had been building became the model the Territorial Commission adopted for 3 other counties, and this produced a degree of recognition from Topeka that came with a modest increase in the office's budget and the addition of a deputy assessor, a young man named Franklin Ward, who had come west from Illinois with genuine ability and a willingness to learn. Vernon taught him with the same matter-of-fact assumption of competence that he had always extended to people, and Franklin learned fast. Lavinia, who had been spending her time between the house on Main Street East and the Merritt farm, now had the particular challenge and pleasure of doing both while also raising Thomas, who was an energetic and curious child from the earliest stages, and who showed no signs of moderating either quality as time went on. She also began, somewhat to her own surprise, to be asked for help by other women in similar legal and property situations, partly because of her reputation from the Drummond case, and partly because word traveled in the way it does in small communities. A widow 3 counties over who had been pressured to sell at a fraction of her land's value. A woman in town whose late husband's business partner was attempting to claim the whole enterprise. Lavinia handled these cases with the same thoroughness she had brought to her own, drawing on Vernon's legal knowledge and the network of contacts they had built through the commission work, and she won more often than she lost. In 1882, the spring brought a letter from the Territorial Commission asking Vernon to consider taking on a broader supervisory role across 4 counties. He read the letter at breakfast and then set it on the table and looked at Lavinia. "What does it mean for Dusty Creek?" she asked. She meant the office, the work, the community. She also meant the house on Main Street East and the Merritt farm 24 miles away and Thomas running through both of them. "It means I would keep the assessor office here and add oversight of the other 3, he said. "More travel, more work, more responsibility, better resources for the cases." She looked at the letter and then at him. "Do you want it?" "I think it is the right thing to do," he said. "There are 3 counties worth of people in the same situation Dusty Creek was in, and there is not anyone doing what we have done here." "We," she said, and it was pointed. "We," he confirmed. "Because none of it would have held without your documentation of the original case and without your work since. The commission knows that. Franklin Ward knows it, I know it." He paused. "It would mean more of the same work for you, more cases, more advocacy. Probably more letters to Topeka that move things forward by a month." "I am aware of what I have been doing," she said dryly. "I know," he said. "I am asking if you want to do more of it." She looked at the letter and thought about what it represented. More families, more cases, more opportunities to do what she had been doing, which was fighting for people who did not otherwise have the resources to fight for themselves in the particular legal and administrative terrain that she and Vernon between them had come to understand better than almost anyone in the territory. "Write back and say yes," she said. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Vernon," she said, "I told you in January of 1880 that I would not be any man's convenience. That remains true. But this," she gestured at the letter and at him and at the general configuration of their life, "this is not convenience. This is a life, the one you said you were offering." She looked at him directly. "I would like to keep living it." He reached across the table and took her hand, right there over the breakfast things, and Thomas, who was in his chair and had been watching them with the serene attention of a child who does not yet have words for what he is watching, made a sound that was very nearly approval. The summer and fall of 1882 expanded the scope of their work and their lives considerably. Vernon traveled more, to the 3 adjacent counties, but he always came home, and coming home to Dusty Creek, to the house on Main Street East with the east-facing bedroom, and the kitchen with 2 windows, and the study that had been reorganized to accommodate a small area where Thomas could play while Lavinia worked, was a particular quality of arrival that he had not had before in his years of moving through the territory. He came home to a specific person who was glad he was there, specifically him, and that specificity was everything. Lavinia managed the cases that came to her, the increasingly full filing system in the study, the correspondence with Topeka, the morning hours at the kitchen table with papers spread, and Thomas drawing on blank paper with a pencil beside her. And she managed the Merritt farm through Cutter Briggs and her own visits. And she managed the house and the marriage with the same direct practical competence she brought to everything. And sometimes in the evenings, when Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, she and Vernon sat on the porch in the summer air or by the stove in the winter, and they talked or did not talk, read or did not read. And there was in those moments a quality of happiness that she had not known was possible before she had it, the kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of someone you love completely and who loves you the same way, with full knowledge of what that means. In the spring of 1883, she told him she was pregnant again. This time she told him at the kitchen table over morning coffee, and his smile was the same enormous slow one it had been the first time, and he kissed her again thoroughly, and the coffee went cold again, and Thomas, who was now old enough to observe such things with interest, said, "Again," in the tone of a child who is keeping track of a pattern. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1883, and they named her Clara after Clara Tall Horse, who had become a friend to Lavinia in the way that the occasional friendship does, quietly and genuinely, over shared work and honest conversation. Clara Tall Horse was pleased about this and said so, and the Tall Horse family had Lavinia and Vernon to supper to celebrate. And it was an evening that Lavinia later described to Mrs. Fitch as one of the best evenings she had had in a life that had been accumulating good evenings at a pace she was deeply grateful for. Clara Easton was different from Thomas in every way that siblings tend to be different, which is to say completely, and she filled the house with a different energy than her brother had, and the house expanded to contain it, as good houses do. Thomas was 5 when Clara was born, and he regarded her with the complicated mixture of pride and suspicion that older siblings tend to bring to the arrival of someone smaller, and he resolved it, eventually, in the direction of pride, which anyone who knew his parents had predicted from the beginning. By 1884, Dusty Creek was a different place than it had been in November of 1879, when Lavinia had fired 2 shots through a land office window, and a tall man in a gray coat had spoken up from the hitching post outside. The county had a functioning and honest property registry. The 7 remaining fraud families had all received resolution. The assessor's office had a reputation that brought people in from 3 counties when they needed genuine help. Drummond served his time in the territorial penitentiary and was released in 1887, at which point he left Kansas entirely and was not heard from in Dusty Creek again. Miss Alice Pryor, who had long since stopped being so shy, married a farmer named Thomas Dale in 1882 and now lived 8 miles from town, and came to Sunday services with 3 children and an expression of a woman who had found her way. Horace the salesman had stopped traveling the circuit and opened a proper dry goods store in Dodge City. Mrs. Fitch ran her boarding house until 1885, when her sister from Abilene came to live with her, and they expanded it into a proper small hotel, which Mrs. Fitch managed with the same combination of absolute standard and genuine warmth that had always characterized her operation. Cutter Briggs stayed on the Merritt farm, which Lavinia would have had to remove him from by force. The farm thrived. Cutter hired 2 younger men to help with the cattle operation that had grown steadily, and he wrote reports to Lavinia every month in his careful, unschooled hand that she read with enormous affection, and sometimes aloud to Vernon in the evenings. The Merritt farm was Thomas and Clara's second home, as much as the house on Main Street East was their first. They knew it from earliest memory, the particular light of it, the fields and the repaired barn and the well in the yard, the story of it that their mother told them not as a tale of hardship, but as a tale of persistence and of land that belonged to this family and would continue to do so. Lavinia took Thomas out to the farm on a spring morning when he was 8, just the 2 of them, and she walked him over the North 40, the 40 acres that had started everything, and she told him the whole story without softening any of it. The fraud, the barn fire, the land office, the man who had come from Wichita with a sealed letter from the commission, the 4 hours of paperwork at the table, the trial, all of it. Thomas listened with the serious attention he had brought to listening from the earliest age. "Were you scared?" he asked when she had finished. "Yes," she said, "but being scared does not mean you stop." He thought about this. Then he said, "Is that why you teach the other ladies, the ones who come to the house?" She looked at him. At 8 he had his father's dark brows and his mother's eyes and a quality of perception that regularly startled her. "Yes," she said, "because someone helped me when I needed it. And because people deserve to keep what is theirs." He nodded. The spring wind moved across the North 40 and the grass was coming in green and clean. "Papa helped you," Thomas said. "Papa came and did the work that needed doing," she said. "And I let him, which was not the easiest thing I ever did, but it turned out to be the right one." Thomas looked at the field. Then he said, with the directness of a child who does not yet know how unusual it is to say true things plainly, "I am glad you let him." "So am I," Lavinia said. "Every day." Vernon was at the assessor's office when she got back to town, and she stopped in on the way back through, Thomas still with her. And she stood in the doorway of the office and looked at Vernon behind the big desk, bent over a document with his brow furrowed in that particular way he had when he was working through something complex. And Thomas slipped past her and went a climb into the chair beside his father's desk, where he was accustomed to sitting when he came to the office. And Vernon looked up and saw them both, and his face did the thing it had been doing for years, that particular clearing and warming that came when Lavinia walked into a room. "Good morning out there," he asked. "Very good," she said. "We walked the North 40. He looked at her over the desk, and she saw that he understood what she had done, why she had taken Thomas out there, and what it meant. "He asked if you were scared," Vernon said quietly. "I told him yes," she said, "and that it does not mean you stop." "Wise advice," he said. "I have a good example," she said simply and without ceremony, the way she said the truest things. Franklin Ward, who was at the adjacent desk and had been discreetly reviewing a document, pretended very convincingly that he had not heard any of this. The years continued, as good years do, without the drama of crisis, but with the steady accumulation of life. There were difficult seasons and easy ones, cases won and cases that did not resolve as they should have. A drought in 1886 that hit the Merritt farm hard and required 3 lean years before the herd rebuilt to full strength. Vernon's supervisory role expanded again in 1885 to include 2 more counties, and the travel was sometimes long and sometimes wearing. But he always came home, and home was the house on Main Street East with the east-facing bedroom, and the kitchen full of people, and the study where the filing system that Lavinia maintained was the most comprehensive document of land rights in the eastern Kansas Territory. In 1887, Lavinia was formally engaged by the Territorial Commission as a consulting advocate for land fraud cases, the first woman to hold such a position in the territory. She received the letter on a Tuesday morning in April and read it at the kitchen table while Vernon had his coffee, and Thomas, who was now nearly 6, and Clara, who was 3, argued about something involving a wooden horse at the far end of the table. She read the letter and set it down and said, "They are paying me." Vernon looked up for the advocacy work. "Yes," he smiled. "It took them long enough." 7 years, she said. "You have been doing it for 7 years, he said. "I have been benefiting from it for 7 years. It is overdue." "It is," she said. And then she said quietly, with the particular gratitude that she had learned to say out loud rather than keep inside, "I never expected any of this. When I walked into that land office in November of 1879, I expected to get my land back or die trying. I did not expect." She gestured at the kitchen table, the children, the letter, the window where the April light was coming in gold and clean. "I know," he said. He reached across the table, past the children and the argument about the wooden horse, and took her hand. "Neither did I," she looked at him. They had been married 7 years, and she knew his face better than she knew her own in a mirror, and she still felt, looking at him across a breakfast table with children making noise between them and the assessor's papers at his elbow and the commissioner's letter in front of her, the same thing she had felt on the porch of Mrs. Fitch's boarding house in the January snow, the thing she had been fighting and then stopped fighting and had been grateful ever since for stopping. "Vernon Easton," she said. "Lavinia Easton," he said back. She had taken his name when they married. She had also kept Merritt, using both, which had raised a few eyebrows in Dusty Creek in 1880, and had not raised any after 1882, because by then everyone understood that Lavinia Merritt Easton was doing as she chose, and the eyebrows were wasted effort. Thomas looked up from the argument about the horse and regarded his parents with the expression of a child who has seen this sort of exchange before and finds it simultaneously tedious and reassuring. "Are you two going to do that thing again?" he asked. "What thing?" Vernon asked. "Where you look at each other like that," Thomas said. "Probably yes," Lavinia said. Thomas sighed with the profound resignation of a 7-year-old who has come to terms with his parents being embarrassing. Clara, who was 4 and had no such reservations, climbed off her chair and went to put her arms around her mother's neck, and Lavinia lifted her into her lap and kissed the top of her head, and the kitchen was warm and loud and full of morning light. The North 40 of the Merritt farm still grew good grass in the spring and good wheat in the right years, and Cutter Briggs still walked it in the early mornings with the particular contentment of a man who has found his place on the earth and intends to stay in it. The house her father had built still stood at the center of the property, sound and solid as he had built it, with new glass in all the windows now and a front step that had been replaced twice. The kitchen table where Lavinia and Vernon had sat on her 30th birthday and told each other true things was still there, worn smooth with use. And sometimes on summer weekends, the Easton family came out to the farm, all 4 of them, and Lavinia walked the North 40 with the same feeling she had carried since she was a girl, the feeling of standing on ground that was hers, that she knew the measure of, that she had defended and would continue to defend. And now she walked it with a husband who had offered her his entire life and meant every word, and 2 children who were learning the history of the place they came from. And she did not take any of it lightly, not a single morning of it. On one of those evenings, sitting on the porch of her father's house in the long summer dusk with the children asleep inside, and the Kansas prairie stretched out wide and quiet in every direction, Vernon put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they watched the stars come out, the same stars that had been above Mrs. Fitch's boarding house porch in December of 1879 when she had said, somewhat accidentally and without intending to, getting less early. "Are you happy?" he asked her. It was a thing he asked her occasionally, not from insecurity but from genuine want of knowing, because he was a man who paid attention, and because she was a woman who did not always say directly when she was feeling something unless asked. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything, turning it over, looking at its actual shape. "Yes," she said, and then she said, "More than yes, I am." She stopped. "I am exactly where I want to be. Everything I have is what I would choose." "I cannot say more than that." "No," he said, "that is enough, that is everything." The stars were coming in over the flat horizon one by one, the way they do on a clear prairie night, patient and numerous, and the summer air smelled of grass and distance. And inside the house the children were breathing in their sleep, and the North 40 was quiet under the Kansas sky. And Lavinia Merritt Easton was 37 years old and held her land and her life, and the man beside her with the same steady grip she had always brought to things that mattered, which was to say completely and without reservation, and she did not intend to let go. She never had been any man's convenience. She had been and had been loved as herself, and that, in the end, was the whole story.